Welcome to Reboot Republic, the podcast that goes behind the headlines and looks at the big issues in this republic of inequality. I'm your host, Rory, and I'm delighted to be joined on the podcast today by Keire Murphy, policy researcher with the ESRI. And Keire is going to set out today something very, very interesting, which I think had a lot of impact when it came out at the time, a recent report on attitudes to immigration in Ireland, and kind of cut through, I think, a lot of the misinformation that exists out there, but also some really interesting kind of analysis of what are people's attitudes towards immigration, towards asylum, and then how that compares to the reality of immigration and asylum seeking into Ireland. And also then we're going to have a chat a little bit about kind of what role the media has played in that and in attitude formation, and then also discuss a bit about the rents and housing and what's going on here. Keire, it's great to have you on Reboot today.
Thanks for having me.
Listen, do you want to launch into the report, kind of some of the headlines in terms of, I suppose, attitudes that you found in your research in Ireland towards immigration and asylum seekers, and what was people's views?
Absolutely. So this report that we published in January was kind of one of a series of reports that we've been doing into attitudes. So over the last few years, we've been trying to kind of understand people's attitudes, not just the levels and different attitudes towards different types of migration or immigration or immigrants themselves, but also kind of factors behind it. So what role is socioeconomic factors playing? What role are community level factors playing? And this piece that we published in January was about what role are misperceptions playing as well. So overall, what we have found kind of across that research program is a drop in attitudes towards immigration over the last few years, but not kind of outside of the historical context in Ireland. So they have been lower. They dropped significantly during the crash in particular. So did a lot of social attitudes. So kind of trust in institutions, trust in other people. A lot of different social attitudes dropped. And they recovered then significantly, and kind of in 2022, we're at a really, really, really high point, and have kind of been declining since then, but still relatively high in a historical context and in a European context. So still the majority of people say that they support immigration from both the EU and outside the EU. You can kind of dig down into that then afterwards and look at EU, non-EU. There is higher support for EU level immigration than there is for non-EU level immigration. And that's true across Europe.
And do you have some of those percentages there in terms of Ireland, just kind of setting out so people do have a sense of that?
Okay. So about 80% of people, according to Eurobarometer research, say that they feel positively or very positively about immigration from EU countries. And about 50% at the moment are saying that they feel positively or very positively about immigration from non-EU countries. And that's kind of dropped from a peak of around 76% for non-EU countries and 92% for EU countries. And again, still quite high in a European context. We're one of the most positive, actually, in Europe.
And we'll come on to this in terms of that's not necessarily the view you would see expressed or kind of given time to in the media, but that's something we'll come on to discuss. And then other attitudes in terms of their perceptions around the number of migrants who are here and what proportion they are of the population.
Yeah, absolutely. So like I said, we've kind of done individual level characteristics and found some really interesting, the factors that are driving. So what makes someone more likely to be positive or negative towards immigration? And we found higher level education systematically makes people more positive towards immigration. Civic engagement makes people more positive as well. So voting or volunteering in the last year, as does, for example, feeling that your life was better in the past makes people more negative towards immigration or is correlated with it. And feeling that you're struggling to make ends meet also correlates with feeling more negatively towards immigration. Community level factors, then, we found that, for example, living in disadvantaged communities, independent of your own kind of, your own socioeconomic situation, so we control for that, is correlated with more negative attitudes, in particular when there's been an increase in migration into those communities. So a lot of different factors, and then this is part of the puzzle. So part of the puzzle is, what do people think is happening in the migration space, and how well is that reflecting reality, and what impact is that having on their attitudes? So really, really interesting findings on this. People overestimate the proportion of the country that is born abroad. So that's kind of one of our definitions of a migrant, as someone who was born abroad. So in reality, kind of the kind of maximum estimate of this is 22%. And people in this survey that my colleagues ran guessed that it was closer to 28%. And I think there's a caveat there. So it's quite a big difference. So people think that getting close to a third of the population was born abroad. And included in the actual 22% is people who were born in Northern Ireland. So they're counted as born abroad in our statistics. And people like me who were born abroad to Irish immigrants. And as you know, I was born an Irish citizen in Australia because my parents had moved there, and then I moved back. So I'm counted in that 22%. And of course, in Ireland, that kind of has a potentially bigger impact than in other countries. So people might not be thinking of that, and thinking also that 28% kind of doesn't include those groups, if that makes sense.
It does, yeah. As you say, it's a big gap between that kind of sense of how many people are born outside Ireland, and then that being 28% being the belief. And then was that broken down then in terms of, as you just spoken about earlier there, areas or different age groups or economic backgrounds, in terms of, did some believe it was higher again?
Absolutely. So we didn't actually look at this, but we did we looked at it in terms of different types of migration. So we asked questions like, what proportion of the people who are born abroad do people think are born outside of kind of the EU, the UK, North America? So the census 2022 found that kind of the biggest groups of people born abroad in Ireland are from the UK. That's the largest group in our statistics. So we asked, do people have a decent perception? And we found that people overestimated the amount of people from kind of outside kind of the Western world, for want of a better word. So the official estimate is that between 7 and 9% are people kind of born outside of the EU, UK, North America. And participants guessed that it was 13.5%. So a decent overestimate, kind of close if you take the lower bound estimate of the official estimate. We also then looked at, so that was kind of the overall stock of migrants, okay, who's living in the country. But then we also looked at the recent, so obviously migration has been in the news a lot since 2022 in particular. So that was when kind of the asylum numbers increased, and when Ukraine happened as well at the same time, and kind of led to this homelessness crisis in Dublin in particular for asylum applicants, and a lot of conversations in the media about migration. So we wanted to assess whether people had a decent understanding of what type of migration there had been in that period of time. And we found that actually people underestimated the proportion of that was kind of outside the EU, UK, and North America. And a lot of that, of course, is because of Ukraine. So quite a large proportion of that migration was Ukraine related. So people underestimated that. But they actually, interestingly, had a really decent understanding of how many of them were from Ukraine. So about 28% of that migration was Ukrainian, and people thought that it was 29%. So a really decent estimate. But they really overestimated what proportion of it was for international protection. So our best estimate is that 11.5%, an absolute maximum of migration since 2022 has been for international protection, and people estimated that it was 18%. So quite a large overestimate. And they really underestimated what proportion of it was for work or education. So our estimate is that it was 46%. And their estimate was that it was 19%.
Your estimate was that 46% of the migration in here since 2022 was for work, whereas the general estimation people were asked, it was much, much lower than that.
Yes, exactly. And where you really see the severe discrepancies in kind of perceptions versus reality is when you ask people about what they think migrants are doing here or what their profiles are like in Ireland. So if we ask about the employment rate, people actually have a decent kind of understanding of the Irish employment rate. They actually they slightly underestimated it, but they actually had a really bad underestimate of migrant employment rates. So people thought that only 52% of migrants are working, when in reality, it's 77%. And actually, people thought that migrants were less likely to be working than Irish people, and the opposite is true. And that makes a lot of sense because a lot of migration is for work. The kind of a very significant proportion of our migration in general, both historically, and that's been quite different in the last few years, especially with the Ukraine flow. But historically, most migration is for work. So it's kind of selective skills, and you need to have a work permit for most non-EU migration to work here. The same was true of third level education. So people really underestimated the third level education rates of migrants, in particular compared with Irish people. So, for example, people thought that 34% of people born outside of Ireland had a third level degree, when actually it's 59%. And again, they thought that it was higher for Irish people than migrants, and it's the opposite is true. And the social housing figures are really stark. Social housing, we were really surprised by both the Irish figures and the migrant figures. So people had a really, really large overestimate of both the migrants that were living in social housing and Irish people living in social housing. So they thought that 44% of people born outside of Ireland were living in social housing. The actual estimate that we have from the Labour Force Survey is 6%. And they thought that 37% of Irish people are living in social housing, when actually it's kind of the estimate we have from the Labour Force Survey is 9%.
They're really, I suppose, they're the big kind of stark, as you say, kind of big gaps between perception and reality. If we go through them, because they're actually quite interesting. I think the first one in relation to work, you set out there that the perception amongst people in Ireland is that in the region of half of migrants, immigrants, asylum seekers are working. But actually, the truth is, you said, I think 77% are working. And the question is, where does that gap in perception come from?
I suppose what we often see in migration is that the type of migration we talk about is not kind of the largest type of migration. The most common type of migration is regular, it's for work, it's through the official system, EU migration, people from the EU coming here to work, or people coming through the employment permit system, which of course is highly regulated. You have to have a job and an employer sponsor you. You have to go through this process to make sure that there are labour market shortages in that sector in Ireland, etc. That all kind of happens, normally. It's administrative. It's not the most exciting thing in the world, and it tends to not be what we talk about. It tends to not kind of get as much attention as a regular migration, which I think raises more fears among people, and kind of gets more media attention. And in particular, I think, of course, asylum got a lot of media attention in the last few years because there was that homelessness. It was very salient for anyone living in Dublin in particular. If you walk through the city centre, there were tents kind of everywhere for quite a few months. So it felt, you don't kind of think of the people who are going to work, who are kind of renting apartments. It's not as salient. And Ukraine, of course, was a very salient form of migration in the last few years as well.
Yeah, and it kind of points to, again, for me anyway, there's a lot of that, when you step back and look at it, you go, what kind of, stories were people being told through the media by various different, political and you could call them far right, people who were, very clearly anti-immigration and using opportunities to express these views. And obviously this is not unique at all to Ireland. We look at what's happened internationally, that anti-migrant kind of rhetoric and politics and viewpoint has been expressed regardless of actually the factual basis to it. And kind of you as a researcher and having looked at that, kind of how important do you think it is, how important a factor, not just the actual, as you say, the manifestation of, government policy decisions to, not provide accommodation to asylum seekers that then results in this, very public manifestation of people seeking asylum and the very stressful situations that they were in. But actually then the kind of the stories, the narrative been kind of communicated around that is one shaped by not, for example, concern for these people or, questioning kind of policy, but a lot of that narrative is shaped like, oh, these are the problem here, this is illegal, that how, when you look at it and analyze it, like objectively, where do you see the big influences coming in terms of what's shaping people's attitudes to that situation?
Well, I suppose it's a really interesting question. People raise the media a lot, and we're actually, I think we're hoping to do some research to look at the media, because we did ask about the media in this research as well. We just haven't kind of got the analysis yet. But I think it's really, really important, and the research that we've done in this program so far has shown the role of a lot of different things. So kind of socioeconomic background, like I mentioned earlier, does have significant impacts on your attitudes towards immigration. Misperceptions do too. And of course, that's kind of where narratives and potentially the media and different areas come in. And we looked at that in here, actually. So we looked at the role that misperceptions have on attitudes, and we found significant impacts. Or let's say, the two are correlated. So having misperceiving, so overestimating the migrant population is correlated with more negative attitudes. In particular, overestimating the recent migration for asylum is correlated with more negative attitudes. And those impacts are quite big. So when you compare them, my colleagues who did this work compared them with other things that we know impact attitudes towards migration, and found that some of them were as important as some of those big things. But those other big things are things like feeling that your voice counts politically. So feeling that your voice counts in the country. And we saw also that correlation with civic engagement, volunteering, voting. So there's really distinct kind of socioeconomic, political engagement and empowerment factors that the research very clearly points to. So like I mentioned, higher levels of education clearly correlated with it. Feeling that you can make ends meet easily, clearly correlated with positive attitudes. Feeling optimistic about the future, for example, is correlated with more positive attitudes, as is contact with migrants as close friends and family. There are other things then too, that really matter. So these are kind of like the real like economic reality. So we often say kind of in the research that the social and economic, these bigger social and economic factors really matter for migration as well. So even if we change the story, we might not necessarily, that's not the whole picture, I suppose, is kind of the point that we try to make, that there are deeper factors at play here as well. So we found things like, the more residentially segregated an area is, the more likely people are to have negative attitudes. That's basically kind of clusters of migrants and non-migrants, rather than people kind of spread out. So things like spatial geography really matter. We also looked at things like how many migrants actually live in your local area. Does that matter? We found, this is a really interesting piece of research, actually. So we found that it doesn't actually correlate on average. So if you have lots of migrants or not many migrants, it doesn't on its own have an impact. Nor does kind of a recent increase into your area. So we looked at the change between the 2011 census and the 2022 census. But that's actually because it's having the opposite impact in more disadvantaged and less disadvantaged communities. So an increase between 2011 and 2022 was actually slightly improving attitudes in less disadvantaged, kind of more well off, for want of a better word, communities, and a negative impact in more disadvantaged. So potentially there are implications there for things like the kind of social infrastructure, clubs and communities that are there at a local level, kind of NGOs or residents committees there at a local level, the social activities that happen, but also potentially the selection effect of types of migrants that live in different areas. So it could be that lower skilled migrants are living in more disadvantaged areas, and kind of higher skilled, let's say tech or EU migrants, for example, that we often see are moving into kind of better off areas because potentially they have more of a choice. But crucially, in our last piece of research has found that kind of, migrants are not more likely to live in disadvantaged areas, if that makes sense. That's often a narrative that we hear as well. Actually, the single most significant thing that determines where migrants live in Ireland is the availability of rental accommodation.
Yeah. Yeah. And in terms of then, there's also an implication of that when you follow through. We see, for example, the recent figures in homelessness and the increase in terms of non-EU and EU people from the EU and from across the EU from non-EU backgrounds who are homeless. And then, the Taoiseach and others kind of citing this as an issue around, are they legitimately entitled to housing and being entitled to homelessness here? But this pointing to, the increase in homelessness being underpinned by and linked directly with an increase in immigration. But actually, when you in some ways it's very consequential from our rental market, because as you say, there's a much higher proportion of migrants who are renting the private rental sector, and therefore are more exposed to evictions, for example, rental issues, are severely under resourced. So it's inevitable that you're going to see higher levels being homeless as a result.
Yes. So actually, we've done some really interesting research on this too. So we do this monitoring, report, and integration, and the last one we looked at housing in particular, because of course it's a particular area, and we found that migrants are significantly more likely to have housing affordability issues. So this is we define as spending over 30% of your income on housing. So we have I think off the top of my head, 50% of non-EU migrants are spending more than 30% of their incomes on housing. And they're significantly more likely. So migrants across the board are significantly more likely to be at risk of poverty after housing costs. So, and a lot of that is to do with exposure to the private rental sector. They're much less likely to be homeowners.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they're less likely to be homeowners and therefore more exposed to housing precarity, and so therefore more likely to become homeless and being made homeless. But it's disappointing to see, some people making that case that they're trying to draw the causality from immigration rather than looking at the causality of where migrants are going within the housing system, which makes them actually more exposed and more vulnerable, and more precarious in terms of homelessness. And I think that's something that when we kind of go back to the questions around immigration and the rates of immigration perception versus reality, it's not just that people misunderstand or fed misinformation, but it's also what is being said to them and what they're feeling as well. People are being said they're taking they are the cause of homelessness. We hear the Ireland is full arguments and very strong campaigning and messaging around that within local communities, and particularly targeted disadvantaged communities, and issues that arise, whether it's housing, someone being entitled to a home or not. We see it's an agitation and organizing by politicians and activists, as I said earlier, around the right, the far right, and anti-immigrant sentiment, and not just the far right. Other parties as well doing it, that are kind of using housing as a political organizing tool that is trying to shape and say, well, the problems result from immigrants and the problems result from asylum seekers, rather than going, actually, the problems that you're facing and that you're feeling and experiencing, the lack of GP services, not feeling heard by the political system, suffering entrenched, disadvantage, inequality, exclusion, does not come the cause of that is not from immigrants or asylum seekers. It's the way we organize our economy and society in a deeply unequal way. But the organizing around that to shift that blame leads then to these perceptions and misperceptions and blaming. And I think that, I wondered, in terms of your analysis, does it pick up that it is kind of those unequal distribution of resources in society are being shaped and tooled as an anti-immigration sentiment to kind of, I suppose, foment that?
Yeah, so it's not, I suppose it's not something that we've looked at in our research. One kind of interesting thing that we did look at was whether kind of local services, an objective analysis of local services, so things like GP shortages, were correlated with more negative attitudes, and we found actually that they weren't. So having kind of a shortage of GPs in your local area wasn't necessarily correlated with more negative attitudes towards immigration. That doesn't mean that that's not one of the, that's not something that people really care about. But what the research points to is that people think about immigration on a national level. So it doesn't necessarily have to impact them personally. So they call it sociotropic concerns. So people are worried about how it impacts the country as a whole, even if it's not impacting them. So, for example, we found, that housing tenure kind of wasn't predictably. Actually, I think we found that people in the private rental sector were slightly more positive towards immigration, even though theoretically, that's where there might be some more competition than, for example, if you own your own home. So it's often not predictable kind of how attitudes map onto individual circumstances, because people are kind of concerned about how it impacts the country as a whole, and that's where kind of how they understand how it impacts the country as a whole really matters.
And I think as well, then, I suppose, to just come on to the kind of how these can be reshaped and shaped, I think, in terms of, changing, and what can engender positive attitudes, and where examples of, positive experiences of integration. Your research found again that, where people were engaging with migrants and where there was those relationships and interactions, that there was a much more positive view on immigration. And again, it kind of shows that this isn't just a one-way train towards anti-immigration sentiment, that there is actually other things going on here, that, there's very much a positive experience possible. And of course, your original point that actually the majority of Irish people are supportive of immigration is a point that's important to reiterate, that these are minority views, and it's important, obviously, to understand why.
Yes. So I suppose in terms of positivity, so I think, things like finding that voting and volunteering leads to positivity indicates that things like political empowerment and that kind of, local level community work might play a really important role here, not just linked to migrants, but also kind of just focused on communities themselves. So again, feeling that life. So all of these are bigger social and economic issues. But we also find that, and this is a really, really consistent finding, that positive contact with migrants leads to improved attitudes. Not all contact is positive contact. So sometimes kind of, just passing people in the street or acquaintanceship contacts don't lead to more positive attitudes. But that kind of structured, common goals, institutionally sanctioned contact does, and especially friends or family. So if you have migrants in your friends or in your family, that leads to more positive attitudes. So there's definite hope there for kind of, what integration looks like. I think one really interesting thing that emerged from some of the literature for me was this finding that often when there is an increase in migration, so something like the kind of Ukraine increase, for example, although, just to clarify also, the rates of migration in the last few years are still not below. They still haven't reached the rates of migration that we had in 2007, for example. So it's not that this is kind of unprecedented rates of migration, and that's often something I think that's missing from the conversation. They're from different countries, so largely before 2007 or before the crash. the EU East group was quite large in the migration data, but numerically, we're kind of at similar levels to then. But yes, so one of the things that emerged is that kind of when there is an increase, often there's a decline in attitudes, and then slowly attitudes improve. So one hypothesis was they talk about these two kind of this group threat theory. Okay, so it's this idea that people feel kind of that they are competing for finite resources with other groups. It's why their perception of both the resources and the other groups are kind of what matters. So like you were saying there. But then there's also this contact theory that says that people kind of develop their attitudes based on contact with those groups. So one hypothesis from the literature is that group threat works really quickly. So when there's an increase, especially into your area, so you might see this, we see this a lot, I think, with the asylum seeker centres. People kind of quickly have quite a negative kind of scared, oh God, what's this about attitude. And then the contact works more slowly. So they're actually just working at different paces, and then that kind of slowly improves attitudes. And I think we see that generally, there's a lot of anecdotal evidence for that happening across the country, where initially people are quite frightened by the idea of centres opening, and then kind of slowly they get used to them, they start to meet people. And attitudes can then actually be more positive. So we did look at this in the community level paper that we did in the journal article, and we found it was quite a small sample size, but we found that attitudes were actually slightly more positive in areas with an IPAS centre.
Which is very interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, and
those attitudes would be more positive.
Yeah, and we found also. So we looked at kind of rural urban areas. So whether living in a rural area, so generally is associated with more negative attitudes. So people living in urban areas tend to be more positive towards immigration in general. And we found that was true, but that it actually gets more positive in rural areas the larger the proportion of migrants is in those areas. So having a larger proportion of migrants actually starts to bring rural areas up to the levels of positivity we often see in urban areas. So there's plenty of kind of hopeful data that you can look for as to how integration works. And if you look at kind of migration history, generally integration tends to work quite well over the long term in a lot of countries. And I think a lot of people will quote the Irish and Italians in the US, for example, as really positive, integration stories. But that does not happen on its own, I suppose. So, I suppose it does, or a lot of structural economic policy factors are highly linked to that happening, basically. So your integration policies, the extent to which you let people work, for example. So until May 2024, we actually didn't let the spouses of general employment permit holders work. So we let them bring their spouses, but we didn't let those spouses work without getting a separate employment permit. So that kind of thing, has kind of potential integration impacts, negative integration impacts, for example.
Mm. And also, I think in influencing kind of those attitudes, and you mentioned about the IPAS centres and the negative initially, and then it gets positive. Like, there's no doubt that, for example, we've seen the Says No campaigns, creating a lot of fear and that negative attitude around areas. And then you often have, and we've seen, incredible work done in community level by, the East Wall for All and the groups across the Finglas for All across the country. Groups organized, community groups get organized on a welcoming basis, on a base of challenging, fears and racist ideas, and doing a huge amount of work, kind of campaigning at a community level, talking to people, explaining and working with both people in the IPAS centres, asylum seekers, but also the local communities around issues affecting them. And I think it does show that work at the grassroots community level can really shape kind of the outcomes of attitudes and how society is.
That's definitely my instinct, and I think it's really important to talk about the what has happened in that space in the last 15 years. And a lot of those projects were significantly cut during the austerity years, and often not restored, budgets not restored, or staff kind of not restored. So we talk, we might talk about community resilience. It's certainly, so I used to work in preventing violent extremism, and that was what we talked about in that space. Community resilience. What does a resilient community looks like? It's, a community that's empowered, that feels that it has agency, that feels that its voice matters, that feels like there isn't division, there aren't enormous divisions that people can kind of then play on to kind of divide and create that sense of threat, and where people are kind of, economically included as well. So I think, those are really crucial. And I think the story of the community sector over this period of time, in particular in kind of advocacy and political empowerment, has played kind of a key role in potentially reducing the resilience of communities, in particular disadvantaged communities.
Absolutely. There's no doubt that, cuts to community projects during austerity, cast a long shadow on the capacity of communities to work on integration and even to support youth work, to support community development work, and left, disadvantaged communities even more isolated. And again, as your research shows, those attitudes towards immigration in disadvantaged areas, and that is fueled by that exclusion, that real I suppose sense, and not just sense, but experience of not getting the same, access to health services, housing, and across the board opportunities and possibilities and actual resources into communities that are suffering and need to be. And I think that's the point of, coming together. And it brings us on to housing being a big area. Just to finish off with, Keire, you had an article in the Sunday Independent there in relation to the rents, and another, I know it was your own views expressed, but I think it's quite interesting because a lot of our listeners would be very interested in the issue of housing and rents. But just your take on the government policy change that, in terms of the rental changes, you point out that the arguments around supply, that what impact will this actually have on supply, and the question of affordability, and what type of housing system are we creating through this policy?
Yeah, so this is my other hat. I write in a personal capacity for The Independent, and I've written 2 pieces now on the rent reforms, and I think you could probably tell from that I am a renter. So I wrote one from the perspective of a renter, and the answer was, it's quite scary. I think one of the few hopes that a lot of people like me had were these kind of rent control properties where rent was still relatively affordable, and felt like a feasible thing that you could actually pay for on kind of a normal salary. And that kind of, I suppose it's kind of taken those away. So that is very stressful, I think, for a renter who's going to be looking for a house in a couple of months. But then, of course, there's a security of tenure thing. So, that's kind of, it's almost on the other side, creating this very different power dynamic between renters and landlords. So I think Michael Byrne has pointed out that, in the previous regime, which of course still applies to existing tenancies, there's not a single day of your tenancy when you're not afraid of being given an eviction notice, no fault evictions. And now it will be a very different regime. So this kind of 6-year rule for small landlords, and a limited no fault eviction. So it's kind of, it was kind of a give and take. So that was kind of from the renter perspective. And I think my overall, perspective was that it was all really confusing and nobody seemed to really understand. And the exodus from the market story is really interesting because, of course, these don't apply to existing tenancies. So I think there seems to be quite a large misunderstanding, or kind of an exiting the market based on vibes thing happening. And then the other piece was this idea that incentivizing the private sector to deliver housing will solve the housing crisis. So there's a few points that I made, and one of them is that the private sector has no incentive to deliver enough supply to drop either house prices or rents, because their income, right, is dependent on house prices and rents. So, especially for the larger landlords, there is no incentive. And it's really, really, really important when we're talking about the private sector and incentivizing the private sector to understand the incentives of the private sector. They have a profit incentive, and that is sometimes at odds with society's, what works for society. So if it gets to the point that rents start to drop because of the supply, the private sector has no incentive to continue increasing the supply. So it's almost this idea that rents need to increase for rents to decrease. But then you have the exact same viability issue if rents are decreasing. So the idea that it will ever decrease rents, I think is not supported strongly in the evidence. There is, though, also a supply crisis. So this, we're talking about homelessness. We're talking about people not being able to find housing. So there's still a conversation to be had. And the other points that I made are that, there's a lot of people who,
I think it's very fundamental that, the point being made that we're going to incentivize rents to rise even further by reducing the intertenancy control, the 6-year market change. So essentially allow higher rents. But rents are already, absolutely one of the highest in Europe, completely unaffordable for anybody on most incomes. So they're going to continue to increase as long as you have this huge supply-demand mismatch, which the Department of Finance says is going to last till the end of the 2030s. So there's no point in the near future that rents are coming down. Rents are going to continue to increase. But that's not economically sustainable. It's not socially sustainable. So something has to give.
I mean, this is it. So the question of economic sustainability, potentially it's kind of economically sustainable from the perspective of investors, but it socially is the question. So I think the second point is that there's a lot of people, and if rents continue to increase and, if costs continue to increase, they will become an increasingly large portion of the population who it's not profitable to house in this way. So social housing kind of looks after the bottom proportion of the income distribution. And it's actually, increasingly small, seeing as we sold off a lot of social housing stock. And then, it's profitable to house, let's be super generous and say 50% of the population. That leaves quite a large chunk in the middle who it's not, who aren't being served kind of by either of these tenure types, if that makes sense. And that's where kind of cost rental. Yeah, you know better than I do. Kind of this idea that this is going to sort out the housing situation for everybody is, I think, not really founded in evidence. And, my fear is that I fall into that proportion. So I really care about that. And the third is that there are very large costs to relying on the private sector for delivery, because what it is profitable for the private sector to deliver is often not what's beneficial to society. So 3-bed houses on greenfield sites in the suburbs are really profitable for the housing sector to deliver, or for the private sector to deliver. And that creates really big issues with urban sprawl. It's really expensive. They're really expensive to service for the government. So I think I said something along the lines of, we all pay with our taxes for the profitability of that type of housing, because, the post is more expensive to deliver there, and water, electricity, Wi-Fi, public transport. And then it creates this car dependency as well, because it's very difficult with such low density housing to justify really good transport options. So there's all these kind of other issues, and this idea of that, we have more 3-bed houses than kind of, we have a mismatch of supply between the type of housing that we need and the type of housing that we have and that's being built. So the majority of people on the social housing waiting list are waiting for a 1-bed property, because there is a very large undersupply of that type of property. And then kind of a large, I wouldn't call it an oversupply because it's a supply crisis just across the board, a mismatch where there's too many kind of 3-bed houses. So that means that people like me, people in their 30s are sharing 3-bed houses with other people in their 30s who, I think many of us would like to have our own kind of houses at this point. And then there's issues with not enough options for downsizing for older people who'd like to move into smaller spaces. So it creates all these other social problems. And I think that's where the kind of profit incentive and the social benefit or the social costs of that need to be managed really carefully and kind of potentially, yeah, I think just managed and led really carefully by government to make sure that mismatch doesn't create large social problems.
And it already is, as you are evidence of, creating large social problems, and that are just, as I described them, it's a social catastrophe. There's no getting away from it. Like, you've, your generation, as you say, sitting there in your 30s, and, you should have a home of your own to be an independent adult and not be reliant on, house sharing with strangers. Like, it's not right. It's not. And it's incredible how it's being normalized. That's what kind of really frustrates and shocks me.
Yeah. I mean, because I moved here from Switzerland, and before that I was in the Netherlands, and I think it never fails to shock me how different the experience of housing is. In Ireland, I'm in my 30s. I'm professional, and I consider myself lucky that my house heats in the winter. Like, that's kind of the level that so much rental housing is at. So yeah, it's and again, and so many people emigrate because of it, because they just really feel like they can't start their lives, or that their quality of life is just so poor because of it. And I think people my age, which is unusual, I'm in my 30s, so I think in the past we kind of would have seen immigration as a younger thing. But I have quite a few friends who have emigrated for exactly that reason.
Yeah. It's just it's a shit show comes to mind. It's like just absolutely, beyond words at this stage. And it just that as you say, as you point out in the piece, like this expectation and reliance on the private sector to deliver and sort our housing system is just, as you say, not backed up by the evidence, but it's actually illogical, because it's not going to serve the social needs that are very complex and are not, as you say, profitable and sufficiently profitable. And this idea that the private sector will build to the point at which it provides affordable housing is just like it's an illogical idea, that and it's anyway, we will continue, and I will continue to highlight that and work on it. But Keire, listen, it was great to have you on Reboot. I really appreciate you coming on and giving your analysis and your views. It's really, really useful and interesting, and I know our listeners would have got a lot out of it. So thank you for coming on.
Great. Thanks for having me.
That was Keire Murphy there. Tony, as always, thank you for producing. And listeners will be delighted to know that Tony got a haircut. He got about, I think, a quarter of an inch off. So he's gone from having lovely, long, flowing locks to having slightly short.